make sure that you guys look at it. Now, the only thing I'm pretty sure we will definitely get through, because we have another week of class, we'll definitely get through it, all of the semester material, right? So chapter 14, even though it looks kind of daunting, it's actually pretty short. It'll probably take, you know, maybe the next couple hours, and then on Wednesday, make that Thursday, we'll kind of discuss the start of chapter 15, as well as making sure that you guys go and look online at the videos for lab material. Now, again, I'm gonna have combination of cadaver stuff and combination of that, as well as models. We're able to look at models. I like using pictures and models just because it's so much easier for us to see something that's tangible. And sometimes the pictures of a cadaver, the problem is that some of the ways you've taken the picture, it's hard to blow it up so that you could see it with clarity. And then it makes it hard to put little tags on it. It takes a long time to set those up. So it's one of those things where I'm probably gonna start setting it up in the next, probably the next day, get started with it. So then by next week, Monday or Tuesday, I can release both the lab practical material, and with the final exam, the lab practical and the final lecture exam, I will give you until Monday night to get that done, right? So I'll give you an extra couple days to get those done. So, I mean, you know, like Sunday midnight, Monday morning, how about that? And I'll give you guys an email about that as well.
And
right?
what is
Now,
the next lab practical?
Chapter 14 is all about sensory integration. So we talk about sensory integration, we're mainly talking about what are the senses? Because we've talked about some of them. And sometimes when you're looking at those, let me move this over. Sometimes when we're looking at the sensations, you'll hear words that you might not be used to, like modality, right? So modality is a combination of the nerves, the messages it carries, and the pathways that carries that information upwards. So we will use those terms. We'll talk about these special senses, talk about general senses, talk about the differences, as well as talk about the pathways to bring that information up into the postcentral gyrus. Remember that postcentral gyrus is the part of the brain that needs to be activated for us to, right? It needs to be activated for us to be able to actually have that sensation. If we didn't have that postcentral gyrus region become active, meaning that every other thing else is good, you know, the receptor is good, the pathway is good, but that region in the brain, people might have had a stroke, traumatic brain injury, that region of the postcentral gyrus is damaged, well, you're still not gonna have that sensation. So you need that postcentral gyrus region to be fully active and fully functional. Again, in order to have a sensation, we need a receptor, an initial sensory neurons to bring it into the spinal cord. Once it goes into the spinal cord, you need a pathway to bring that information from that area of the spinal cord into the thalamus on the other side of your brain. And then from the thalamus to a specific region in the postcentral gyrus, we call the somatic sensory cortex. So the somatic sensory cortex, also called the postcentral gyrus, it's been mapped, and we know that if we activate certain areas with an electrode, people have a sensation for that targeted area. So we know this because when people do open, you know, when people doing like a brain surgery, they will normally put person to sleep, really deep sedation, until they open up the brain cavity and they start actually cutting into the brain matter. Once they cut into the brain matter, the brain itself has no pain receptors. So what we can do then is map out the regions that are not functional and needs to be removed, and we can map out regions that are still functional and we need to keep. So what they'll do is they'll send an electrical signal by an electrode in a particular area of the brain. And if nothing happens, well, that area is dead then. You need to remove that area. But the areas that are still functional, let's say you hit a region of the postcentral gyrus for sensation of your middle finger. You hit that specific area, well, the person's slightly awake. So they'll all of a sudden feel that sensation in their middle finger for pain, pressure, tickle, itch, any of those. So it's kind of cool. And we'll talk about how we look at certain kind of memories and how those memories are actually triggered. And it kind of helps us understand how memories are stored as well. We'll talk about those later on. So let's look about the integration of nervous system functions. And these are all the cell bodies, all in one specific area, which is crazy. Look at how many different colors and how embedded they are right here. And I believe this would be the thalamus. And these are all the dendrites and axons coming from those cell bodies. So you're talking about so many of them clustered together in a small space. Good news is it doesn't take a lot of space to hold a lot of them. The bad news is this: if you have damage in one area, if you have a stroke, a thrombus, an emboli, well, look at how clustered everything is. If one small blood vessel gets occluded, this whole area will be gone. And because of that, you will have loss of sensation that is massive compared to how small we think the actual neurons and the blood vessels are. So in terms of sensations, we need to receive that stimulation from the body and then somehow bring it to the brain. Now, there is something different between perception. Perception is a conscious awareness of stimuli received by sensory receptors. For perception of that sensation, you need some kind of sensory receptor for the sensation we want to stimulate. Let's say pain. Well, we need sensory receptors for pain receptors. Now, once they activate, you need to turn that into a series of action potentials that will then go to the central nervous system by sensory neurons. As it goes into the central nervous system, it's going to go into the spinal nerve by entering the dorsal root ganglia and then the dorsal root on its way to the spinal cord. Within the central nervous system, the spinal cord itself, we have pathways taking that information upwards and then crossing it over. Eventually, you will then terminate that action potential by triggering cells in the postcentral gyrus, which is our sensory cortex. Now, once you put it there, that's not the end. We will need to kind of connect that sensation to previous examples, previous responses, so then we can figure out what to do next. Because remember, a sensation is great, but you need to kind of figure out what is that sensation. Do we like that sensation or do we not like that sensation? And then you want to link it to previous examples of that sensation, so then you can have a response to that sensation. So you need to bring that, in order to have that kind of perception, you need a receptor, then you need a sensory neuron to bring that action potential into the spinal cord. Once in the spinal cord, you need a pathway. That pathway sends that information up the spinal cord into the brainstem and crosses over usually. Now there are sensations that crosses over immediately, but a lot of them will eventually cross over. So then the opposite hemisphere of the brain feels the contralateral side of the body. Then in order to have that actual specific sensation, you need to activate the postcentral gyrus, and the postcentral gyrus has been mapped out. So then we know which specific region needs to be triggered, right? Which specific region of that brain gyrus needs to be triggered for that sensation at that location. Once you trigger that location, now we send that information elsewhere. So then we can activate memories. So then you can link it to previous examples, right? So all of that is very important for that perception of sensation. Now, in terms of general sensations, or types of sensations, there are two main types of sensations, general and special. Now, the easiest way to discuss it is what is a special sense And then anything not a special sense is a general sensation. So special senses are easy. They're everything that's found only in the head area. So we're talking about sight, smell, taste, as well as hearing. And then the last one, balance and equilibrium. Now, you guys have all heard and watched Elmo, and they talk about your senses, right? The 5 main senses in, Elmo's world is smell, taste, sight, hearing, and then touch. Well, touch is not a special sense. A special sensation is a sensation only found in that head region and nowhere else. You don't see anywhere else but with your eyes, which are in your head. You don't smell anywhere else except by your nose, which is in your head. You don't have hearing anywhere else except in your ears, which is also on your head. Balance as well. You don't have balance equilibrium anywhere else except in our ear region, in our head. So anything that is not located in our head region, it is usually a general sensation. Now, we do see general sensations as well in the head region. So we're mainly kind of differentiating those two right here, but keep in mind that they're not mutually exclusive, meaning that in terms of your head, you can have all these special senses as well as general sensation as well. So what do I mean by general sensation? Pain, pressure, touch, tickle, itch, vibration, 2-point discrimination. All of those are all general sensation. So you can easily get a cut in your finger and on your head and on your face when, right, guys, when they're shaving. So in terms of general sensation, they're generalized. They're found everywhere. Pain can be found anywhere, in your face, in your fingers, anywhere. So what we're gonna see is general sensations are just general in location and can be found and triggered anywhere in your body. In terms of general sensations, we have 2 main primary types, somatic and visceral. Somatic is like coming from your skeletal muscles. So anytime you see the word somatic, I want you to think. In terms of motor, goes to the skeletal muscles. In terms of sensations, pinpoint. You get a cut in your finger, you know exactly where you get a cut, even though it's only a paper cut. Even though you might even just get a little sting, that might be enough for you to know exactly where you get that touch. So somatic general sensations are very specific. Body environment, right? So touch, pressure, temperature, proprioception. Proprioception is knowing where your limbs are in time and space. In other words, spatial orientation of the body and limbs. That's very important because what would happen if you have to keep active control of your foot and look at your foot every time you're walking and taking a step? Well, obviously you're not going to be walking far because you can be running into everything. So in order to walk, you need to look straight ahead so you don't run into anything. What happens? We need to know where our limbs are, where our feet, our toes, our knees are in time and space without looking at it. That's proprioception. Knowing your limb location, knowing the extent of that limb movement, and then knowing it without actually visualizing it. You don't have to look at your feet. You don't have to look at any of your other lower body when you're walking because we're getting these proprioceptive signals inherently going into our brain and then into our cerebellum. And it's an involuntary, almost a subconscious behavior. So then we can focus on looking straight ahead or looking straight ahead and listening to music as we're walking. That's proprioception. And then the last one here, pain. Pain is localized and specific when it's somatic. It's like getting a cut on your fingers, your toes. You know exactly where you get that cut. When you pull a muscle, you know exactly which muscle it is that gets damaged. There is no kind of diffuse pain, right? You know, if you pull a hamstring when you're running, you know exactly which hamstring, you know which leg, and you know exactly inherently which muscles to grab as you pull that muscle. Why am I mentioning it? Because the next type of general sensation is called visceral. Visceral sensation is information about internal organs. Now, it's still a general sensation in that you can see this type of sensation in the abdominal organs, the kidneys, as well as the stomach and the GI tract. You can see this type of sensations in the thorax with your lungs and your heart. In other words, these type of general sensations that are visceral is spread out throughout the entirety of your thoracic and abdominal cavities. The difference between the visceral and the somatic is a generalization. Usually, when you have pain in your abdomen, if you have cramping because you have diarrhea, because you have some kind of issues, right, with, you just eat something bad. So what happens is, can you tell and point to a specific region where it hurts? Usually not. It's very diffuse. The whole abdomen cramps up on you, and you're almost hunched over while you're in the toilet. And what happens is, with this kind of visceral pain, it's poorly localized and very general. You can't say, oh yeah, it's my duodenum that's hurting. It's my distal third of my jejunum, right? It's just very non-specific, very diffuse. It occurs, it feels like it's hurting like throughout your whole intestines. You can't tell which specific area is hurting. That's visceral type of sensation. Diffuse with pain and pressure, like when we see with abdominal cramping. Now, in terms of these general and the special senses, they are going to be activated by also different type of receptors. Special senses uses what we call secondary receptors, whereas general sensation uses primary receptors. Primary receptors mean that the sensory neuron is immediately part of our receptor. So Pacinian corpuscles are for pressure. So when you pinch down on these corpuscles, the deeper you pinch and the more force you're kind of squeezing with, the more of these corpuscles you activate, the more action potentials you trigger. And what we're going to see is that Pacinian corpuscle meant as a pressure stimuli or pressure receptor is embedded with the sensory neuron. So as soon as you activate this receptor, an action potential gets triggered on the sensory neuron. In special senses, we use secondary receptors. Now, we see use here for taste. For taste, let's say you're eating something and this has a general sensation of sweetness and it activates the sweet taste buds. Once you eat something with that sweet taste bud or with that sweet taste sensation, you are going to activate the taste cells corresponding to the sweet, and that cell then releases a neurotransmitter that then activates either your facial or your glossopharyngeal nerve, depending on where we are in our tongue. In other words, you need a release of a neurotransmitter. The receptor and the neuron are not linked directly, right? They are linked, but not directly. There's an indirect link where that the cell itself, which is a receptor, this taste cell is a taste receptor. Once it gets active, it releases a neurotransmitter that then activates the sensory neuron. And keep in mind, the sensory neuron is part of our either facial nerve or our glossopharyngeal. Now I'm mentioning this because I do want you to know the facial and glossopharyngeal, the differences for the final exam. Next, types of senses. So if you take a look, there's a lot of general sensations. And if you take a look at the special senses, there's only 5 special senses. And these are senses you probably discussed and heard throughout your lifetime. Taste, smell, right? Hearing, sight. And then the last one you probably haven't heard of, balance and equilibrium. Now, general sensations can be somatic, where they're pinpoint and they're very precise, very localized. When somebody touches you, you look at where you get touched. How many times have you guys been in high school or just walking down the hallway, even in college, and you're walking with a friend and your friend taps your shoulder on the other side. So then you look on the area where you get touched to see who tapped you, right? Well, that is very sensitive. You know exactly where they tap you. That's why you didn't look to the left where they are, you look to the right. So then you can visualize it because you know exactly where you got touched. So all of these somatic sensations are precise, they're local, whereas the visceral ones are imprecise and diffuse. If you have pain in the thorax region, people are having an MI, myocardial infarct. It's very diffuse. They talk about pressure in their whole mid-chest. They talk about pain extending to the left arm. Why? Is that kind of visceral pain is very diffuse and very general. So let's talk again more about specific type of receptors. Now, there are some I want you to know really, in detail, and the types of sensations, right? But if you take a look, none of this is highlighted, right? We will go through it, and then I'll talk about the ones I do want you to know, which are highlighted here. So let's take a look. These are types of sensory receptors: mechanoreceptors, chemoreceptors, thermoreceptors, photoreceptors, and nociceptors. So mechanoreceptors, think of mechanical, meaning you're either trying to stretch, pull, push something mechanically is happening. So it kind of makes sense, compression, bending, and stretching of cells. Well, that's touch, where you're physically touching somebody. Pressure, where you're pushing in a little bit harder than light touch. Proprioception, that's the bending of your muscles as you're trying to move. Hearing and balance, those are all activated by what we call mechanoreceptors. Chemoreceptors are for chemicals. So it makes sense that taste is one of those, right? Smell is as well. Thermoreceptors respond to changes in temperature. Photoreceptors respond to light and vision. Nociceptors for pain, extreme mechanical, chemical, or thermal stimuli, which then causes pain. Now, highlighted materials, the only one that says just pain, understand pain is nociceptor, and we'll talk about others specifically coming up. Again, we've talked about proprioceptors a lot. That's why I highlighted this. Know what they are, right? Associated with joints and tendons. So then you know where your limbs are in time and space without having to look. So what other kind of receptors do I want you to know? The Merkels, which we talked about before. Actually should be over here. The free nerve endings, Meissner's corpuscle, Ruffini's, and Pacinian. So these 5 that are going to be highlighted right here, I want you to know what they are for the final exam. These are those that are really good to kind of discuss on or ask on a multiple choice version of it. So let's talk about free nerve endings first, which is right here. Free nerve endings, direct endings that are part of the receptor itself. And what's happening here is that with free nerve endings, they're the simplest, most common, sensory receptor-less. All right, sensory receptor, right? There's less sensitivity in the visceral, scattered throughout most of the body. So our visceral receptors are of this type, responsible for temperature sensations, including pain from temperature. You've touched something that's extremely cold, it's going to trigger some pain, or extremely hot. Merkel's disc. Now, Merkel's disc we've talked about in chapter 5. These are found in the basal layer of the epidermis. So right at the stratum basale region right here. The Merkel's disc right here, whoops, associated with dome-shaped mounds of thickened epidermis and hairy skin. These are the important parts: light touch and superficial pressure. Those are the modalities that it's responsible for. Again, light touch, superficial pressure. Where are they found? In the basal layers of the epidermis. So the deeper layers of the epidermis. The next one I want you to know, Pacinian corpuscles are lamellated corpuscles. Lamellated means layered, right? Think of onions. I know, right? Like Shrek. So like onions right here, the Pacinian corpuscles, they're really deep. Why is that? Because you can't have pressure unless you have really deep touch, right? When you feel pressure on our body, something you have to push in with a little bit more force to actually have that sensation. So the deeper and the stronger you push onto your skin, the more of these layers you activate. The more layers, then the more action potentials that are triggered, the more your body senses it as really, really deep pressure and really intense pressure. So in terms of Pacinian corpuscles, know what they are, where they're found, and what is their main modality. So lamellated or layered corpuscle, single dendrites, 2 layers of corpuscle arranged like leaves of an onion, found deep, either in the hypodermis or in the deep reticular layer of the dermis. Remember, the papillary layer of the dermis is the layer that it's superficial and makes contact with the epidermis. The reticular layer is the deeper layer, closer towards the hypodermis. So to even activate these receptors, you need to push down with a little bit more force. If you have just a little light touch, these corpuscles don't activate. Instead, then you'll activate the Merkel's disc. The next one's kind of interesting, Meissner's. Now, hopefully we can get back to some kind of normality in the fall. But in the old days, a couple of years ago, I was able to do these tests on students where we're measuring their 2-point discrimination, right? And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense where we have greater sensitivity in 2-point discrimination. And I always use an example. If it's really dark outside, you're taking a class downtown and you're trying to find your keys, do you have to take the keys out so then you can tell which is your house keys and which are your car keys? Or can you just go into your pockets and just by that sense of touch, you can tell which are your house keys and which are your car keys? Almost everybody can tell which are house and car keys just by touch. The reason why is this. In our fingertips, we have greater sensitivity of 2-point discrimination. So when I put my fingers and my hand in my pocket to find my keys, I can feel the little ridges with a little bit more sensitivity. I can feel if it's plastic or if it's fully, right, metal, right? And sometimes they might all be metal or all be plastic. So what happens is you have to feel the little grooves on your keys to see if you got the right ones. In order to find and feel those grooves and to tell the difference between the grooves, you need greater 2-point discrimination. That means when I press down at 2 different points, do you feel 2 different points or do you feel just one? So when we talk about our skin right here and our shoulders, in order for us to have the ability to feel 2 different points here, we need this kind of distance. At this distance, 64 millimeters, when this compass hits your, your shoulder, your skin of the shoulders, when both points hit it, then you'll feel 2 different points. If it's any closer, let's say it's 60 millimeters or 50 millimeters, and I have 2 points hitting at the same time, well, you only feel 1 point. So when you have a chance, all right, even with your brother, sister, boyfriend, girlfriend, I want you guys to test this on each other. You don't need a compass. All you need is basically 2 pins, right? 2 safety pins, or if you have a paper clip, you can just extend it and now you have 2 points. And I want you to test and press down really at a small distance away from each other, right? 2, 3, even 5 millimeters. Test your fingertips. See if you can feel 2 different points. You should be able to. Do the same thing and put it instead of your shoulder on your forearm, right? Same distance with a paper clip, 5 millimeters, maybe an inch, that's it. And I want you then to press down on both sides of the extended paper clip and press down on your forearm and tell me if you can still feel two different points. You shouldn't. The reason why is this. The areas where we make contact with the environment are areas where we usually have the greatest sensitivity in two-point discrimination. In other words, when we are going to grab something, do we grab it with our forearms or do we grab it with our fingers? Obviously, we grab it with our fingers. So if we're grabbing it with our fingers, we need greater sensitivity of that two-point discrimination with our fingers. So then we can feel the texture. So then we can feel all the different ridges and tell the difference between your house keys versus even your work keys. Some of them are just slightly different and you can tell them apart just by touch. That's why. If I do the same thing, I take your house keys and I take your car keys and I put it on your forearm. You can do that as well with your significant other. You can ask them, all right, I have two different keys in your pocket. Close your eyes. Tell me, all right, grab your car keys. They give you car keys almost immediately. Now I want you to do the same thing and say, all right, I have two different keys. Close your eyes. I'm going to put it on your forearm. And you tell me if you can tell the difference between your car keys and your house keys. Most people, when you put those keys on their forearm, they can't tell. They might guess right every now and then, but they can't tell because there's less sensitivity. You can't feel all those grooves because there's less two-point discrimination. There's less sensitivity, right? Instead of feeling one or two grooves, you just feel one, and that's it. Now, other areas where we have greater sensitivity is in our tongue. Anybody's ever eaten something that's got that weird mouth feel, weird texture, right? Now, I used to live in Minnesota, and they used to eat a lot of fish that's kind of weird. If you've ever seen like people on Bizarre Foods, they talk about it. It's called lutefisk. It's kind of fish that's kind of sat and lie for a little bit, and then you have to put water in and get rid of that toxic lye. And then by the time they're done and they've kind of cooked it, the fish itself is supposed to be like a Vaseline. I have never been one to try it because it just looks terrible, but people who actually do try it says the actual meat, the taste doesn't taste bad, but the mouthfeel feels like you're eating petroleum jelly, that it just kind of melts in your mouth, and right, because of it, people hate it if they're never exposed to it as kids. Well, the reason why is because we need greater sensitivity in our tongue because we want to eat things that we are more likely to experience as pleasant and ingest and eat, and mouthfeel plays a big role in that. Again, used to determine texture of objects. The greater sensitivity, the shorter the distance between when you can feel two different points. Now keep in mind, so if I'm asking you, and I want you to think, this should make sense. Because of increased sensitivity here, which region of the brain will have more area responsible for that sensation? Would you have more area for the shoulders or with your fingers and for your tongue, right? So obviously, the greater the sensitivity for that sensation, the greater the area of the brain that's there to translate all those sensations. So you should, and we will, see greater area of our brain gyrus responsible for sensations of our fingers compared to your shoulders, right? Compared to a lot of different larger organs of our body as well. Golgi tendon organ, proprioceptors associated with tendons. We're going to talk about the reflex that's associated with it. Golgi tendon reflex. These are pressure and stress receptors that are there for also knowing where your limbs are in time and space. Next is a nice table here that kind of describes the receptor, what it looks like, and its function. Really good example of that. Now, we kind of mentioned primary versus secondary receptors, and it has to do with the type of sensations that are triggered. All general sensations use primary receptors, where the receptor is actually connected to the sensory neuron. So you don't need a release of neurotransmitters. As soon as a sensory receptor fires, the neuron is connected to also undergoes an action potential. So the receptor and neuron is one connected functional unit. Secondary receptors, you'll have a cell that gets activated, and then you'll release a neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter will activate our cranial nerve for that sensation. Here, this is for taste, like we mentioned, but we'll see something very similar for sight. For sight, we'll have retinal cells that will then activate when different wavelengths of light triggers our retinal cells. Then they'll release a neurotransmitter that will then activate the optic nerve. We'll talk more about the special senses in chapter 15. It's really cool, but it's pretty intense. Right? So this is the second time we've talked about these receptors. You will see some kind of questions on the test about it. Now, responses to sensory receptors. And I do want to discuss, especially the top part, adaptation / accommodation. What is that? Adaptation is decreased sensitivity to a continued stimulus. This is crazy because most of us haven't gone to a restaurant in about 2 months, right? And actually gone in and sat down. But a good example of this is what happens to us when we put on cologne or put on a perfume in the morning. So what happens when you put perfume on, when you put cologne on in the morning, right when you spray it on, you smell it, it smells great, and then what happens? Do you keep smelling it an hour later? Not really, right? You get accustomed to that smell. So then you don't smell it at all. You go to work, you go to class, and as you sit down, your neighbor that sits next to you all the time now gets introduced to that smell. And that's when they make that comment, right? What did you do? Bathe in it? And what happens with them is this. If you sit there long enough, they will also get adapted to that smell, and they will stop smelling it as well. So in terms of adaptation, is that the continued stimulus no longer triggers new action potentials. So you have at that point ignored it. That way you don't keep smelling that kind of scent, and now your neurons can be ready for other smells, other more toxic smells coming in. So we have talked about smell just a second ago. Taste is the same thing. How many of us has gone to 31 flavors, Leon's, and gotten a sundae? And when you get that sundae, you have your first bite of that sundae, and then it's super sweet. Activates your taste buds for sweetness, and it's almost overwhelmingly sweet. And you're like, there's no way I can eat it. It's so sweet. So you take your next bite doesn't taste as sweet. And then like your third and fourth bites, right, you don't even taste how sweet it really is anymore, right? Why? It's because we have adapted to that sweet taste. Now, taste is one of those things we want high adaptability, especially to things that are high in calories. Remember, it hasn't been until pretty recently that we can go out and get food almost anywhere. Now, when that happens, we don't, obviously we don't really want to adapt now. We're more worried about gaining weight for this. But before this recent 100-year span, food was hard to get. So whatever you want to eat and is available, you want to have it be high calorie. And if it's available, eat a lot of it. So then you can store it for a future time. Now that's going to be one of the main things I come back to, especially even in 202, is that our body likes to ingest and then store. So then when we're eating things, right, our body wants you to overeat. That's why diets are so hard, because you don't even realize that you're eating something that's bad for you, like a sundae, right? You don't even realize how sweet it is until you're done, and the whole, right, God forbid, right, whole gallon of ice cream is done. Or even better yet, right, like a potato chip. How many times have you guys taken a potato chip, taken a bite, and realized how salty it was? Like, man, that's really salty. And then you take a next chip because you already bought it, might as well try it and eat it. So you take the next chip, and the next chip isn't that salty. By the time you're done with that bag of potato chips, you're licking your fingers because you barely taste the salt at all. That is adaptation. Adaptation allows us to ingest and eat, and sometimes overeat, so then we can store things for the future. So that excess amount of sugar that we're eating from our sundae, well, that excess amount of sugar gets converted to glycogen and then fat. So then we can store it for times when we don't have food. The problem now is we usually almost always have food. So then we don't have times when we're fasting for days on end because there's no food available, right? So our body, though, still hasn't adjusted to that. And what's happened is now we overeat, we save for the future when we're not eating anymore and we're fasting or starving. But at that point, nowadays, we're not fasting and starving. We're eating the same amount the next day, storing it for times when we are fasting and starving, but the next day we're still getting more and more food. So that's how we keep gaining more and more weight. Now, proprioceptors are also very good at adapting. They provide information about precise body position and rate of movement of various body parts, the weight of an object being held in the hand, and the range of movement of the joint. In other words, in terms of proprioceptors, just by putting a weight in your hand, think of a ball. I use this example. Most of you guys have heard of a shot put, right? Or a basketball or a baseball. When you touch a baseball, even versus, baseball versus a tennis ball. Baseballs are a little bit heavier. Shot puts are definitely heavier. Even without knowing anything about a shot put, most of us, just by weight, just by our innate ability to understand what our body does, we know we should not throw a shot put the same way we throw a baseball, overhand and everything. You'll damage yourself, right? That is one of the ways that proprioceptors help in terms of responding to different types of balls and weights right here. All right, now the main meat of chapter 14 is about these nerve tracts, right? They can be sensory or motor tracts. Now, in terms of sensory nerve tracts, these are all ascending tracts that comes in from our body, ascends up the spinal cord, crosses over, and goes to the thalamus. Different tracts will carry different sensations. So each of these pathways, dorsal column, medial lemniscus, spinocerebellar, spinothalamic, spinal reticular, they're all going to have a specific modality, a type of information that's transmitted. Now the good news is the tract itself allows us to figure out where it's coming from and where it's going. Spinothalamic, spinal cord to the thalamus. Spinocerebellar, spinal cord to the cerebellum. The only one that doesn't tell us is this dorsal column. We'll talk about those specifically coming up. Oh, by the way, Fasciculus Gracilis, where do we see our gracilis muscle? It's in the legs, right? Cuneatus in the arms. So what we're going to see in the spinal cord is this. There are areas of the body where we see both the Fasciculus Gracilis and the Fasciculus cuneatus. There are other parts of the body where we might only see one. So if we are in the brachial region, right, in our thorax region, we might only see the Fasciculus cuneatus. In the lumbar region, where we have limbs and your leg, right, all the sensory information coming in from your legs and your toes, well, and your ankle, all of those come in through this Fasciculus Gracilis. So these corresponds to sensory information coming in from the legs, coming in from the arms. All right, so let's talk about which ones I want you to know. First one, spinothalamic tract. Again, with spinothalamic, know the kind of sensations that are going to be carried. Sorry, oh, my throat's hurting. So spinothalamic tract conveys pain, temperature, tickle, and itch. Now, with the spinothalamic tract, what we're going to see is one of those rare tracts where as soon as that information enters the spinal cord, it enters by what we call a primary neuron, first neuron. That primary neuron has its cell body in the dorsal root ganglia. It's got an axon that goes into the spinal cord, and then an axon that goes all the way to the nerve endings that's found on our skin for pain, temperature, tickle, and itch, right? So if you have pain and you get a cut on your finger, that's going to be carried in by the spinothalamic tract. As you get a cut, you activate nociceptors that are connected, that are part of our sensory neuron. That primary sensory neuron brings that information in, then goes through the dorsal root, and immediately it synapses with a second neuron, called a secondary neuron. For spinothalamic tract, the second neuron crosses over immediately. As it crosses over immediately, it then ascends. So that second neuron comes in, right? It receives the message, then crosses over. Then goes up into the midbrain, into the thalamus on the opposite side. As it goes up in the thalamus on the opposite side, it then makes a last synapse with a third neuron that then triggers a specific region of your postcentral gyrus. That is for your fingertips, because that's where you get a cut, right? So you have a specific area in the postcentral gyrus just for all your fingers. And we're gonna see there's an overrepresentation of sensories, neurons that end here. Why? Because usually when we're manipulating the environment, we're using our hands and fingers. So there's greater sensitivity for our hands and fingers, for pain, pressure, tickle, and itch, and for touch, right? And there'll be a greater area of our brain for your hands and fingers then. Now keep in mind, for the exam, what do I want you to know? Everything that's highlighted, right? Pain, temperature, tickle, and itch. Also understand that this primary neuron coming in synapses with a secondary neuron that crosses over immediately. That's important because if I have spinal cord trauma over here, right? If I have a pinched nerve, and that pinched nerve, right, is on the left-hand side right here. The weird thing is, even though the pinched nerve is on the left-hand side and only this area is affected, the opposite limb will have loss of pain, pressure, tickle, and itch, which is weird. The next pathway I want you to know, the dorsal column medial lemniscal system. This should be in red, right? Not in blue. I want you to know this. What is the sensation modality? 2-point discrimination, proprioception, pressure, vibration. The dorsal column medial lemniscal system sends that information to the cerebrum as well as the cerebellum. It's divided into two main areas. One, responsible for sensations below the waist. One, above in the thorax and above. So Fasciculus Gracilis, sensations inferior to the mid-thorax level, abdomen and legs. So if you have, let's say you are about to kick a ball and you need to know where your legs are, at the same time somebody's trying to block it because you're playing soccer. So what do you need to do? Well, you can't look at the ball. You need to find out where the guy is so then they don't tackle you. So you expect to know where your legs are, so then when you are about to kick the ball without looking, you don't miss. That's proprioception. So we have proprioception in your legs right here. Which signals and where does it go up? It activates the dorsal column medial lemniscal system, and it goes up specifically by the Fasciculus Gracilis. And the Fasciculus Gracilis is this more medial area right here. Now, if you're playing basketball and you're about to take a shot, as you're about to take a shot, someone's trying to block it. So you need to release it a little bit higher and a little bit earlier, so then it doesn't get blocked. Obviously, we need to look at where the guy is, and we can't look at where our hand is. So then what happens is you need proprioception in your upper limbs now. So then you can adjust your shot so it doesn't get blocked. At the same time, if you're looking at your hands, you're going to airball because you don't know where then that rim is. So you need to keep your eyes on the actual basket, right? So as your eyes are looking at the basket, you're getting proprioception signals from your upper body, from your arms, by way of the fasciculus cuneatus. It ascends and then synapses in the medulla, and then goes to the opposite thalamus. So the dorsal column medial lemniscal is very different in some ways than the spinothalamic. The spinothalamic crossed over immediately as it enters, whereas the dorsal column goes up first and then crosses over in the medulla, right? In other words, right, if I have spinal cord trauma here, what happens? Here, right, and come back over here. If I have a pinched nerve at this location on the left side, what happens is this, right? My left arm for 2-point discrimination, proprioception, pressure, vibration, that's lost, right? Because I have a injury here. So I don't get that sensation moving up, right? At the same time, and this is weird because remember, right, this is the left side of the spinal cord. So if I damage the left side, it makes sense I lose this kind of sensation on my left arm because that's the side the spinal cord gets damaged. At the same time though, right, for the spinothalamic tract, you lose sensation on the opposite arm. So pain, pressure, tickle, itch. Well, guess what? You lose that sensation on the opposite arm. Crazy. Right, trigeminal thalamic tract. And we'll get through these sensory tracts and then we'll take a break. All right, so, whoops, kind of skipped it. Spinothalamic, know the sensations, know that it crosses over immediately. Dorsal column, know that it's divided in 2 main sections. Each of the section corresponds to limbs. And what are the sensations right here? Now, notice that all of our general sensations are basically subdivided between these 2 very important tracts. There are other ones as well, but for now, just know these 2 for the rest of the body. So pain, pressure, tickle, itch, that's going to be spinothalamic. Proprioception, 2-point discrimination, vibration, that's dorsal column, medial lemniscus. Now, how about the face then? Because none of those 2 will be carrying message from your face. So how do we bring all of those sensations into the face? That's a trigeminal thalamic tract. The trigeminal thalamic tract is a combination of those 2, the spinothalamic and the dorsal column tracts, right? Those 2 tracts and those 2 type of sensory information, but coming in from the face. So we're talking about all general sensations from the face: pain, pressure, tickle, itch, vibration, as well as proprioception. All of those sensations are carried in by way of this tract, the trigeminal thalamic tract. They're carried in as part of the cranial nerve number 5, your trigeminal. Remember, your trigeminal nerve is your main general sensory nerve bringing information from your facial muscles for proprioception, from your skin for pain, pressure, as well as vibration and two-point discrimination. So all of the messages that we have just talked about in these two other signals, these two other tracts, when we're referring to the brain, to the face, it is only one main tract, and it's going to be brought in by your fifth cranial nerve, which is your trigeminal nerve. So your trigeminal nerve, we kind of mentioned it last chapter, is responsible for all somatic sensations from the face, goes in to the pons region, and then in the pons region, right, it's synapses, where then a second neuron in from the pons region then goes to the thalamus. The thalamus then goes to the postcentral gyrus. They carry similar information to that of the spinothalamic and the dorsal column, but from the face, nasal cavity, and oral cavity. So from your head regions, all those sensations are carried in by the trigeminal nerve. And the trigeminal thalamic tract then sends that information from your face to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus to the postcentral gyrus. Spinocerebellar tract is the only one that doesn't cross over. So write that down, right? All right, so here, and I'll write it down over here. No decussation / crossing over of signals. So in terms of this, the spinocerebellar tract comes from the spinal cord and it goes specifically to the cerebellum. What is it going to do? Well, the cerebellum is very important for movement, modifying movement, and then adjusting, right? Carries proprioceptive signals to the cerebellum, most of which is subconscious, meaning that you don't really actively control. At the same time, you probably don't want to actively control, right? It'll be very tedious if you did. All the minor adjustments, right? Let's say you're walking, and as you're walking, it's not level. So then you make tiny adjustments in how you move so then you don't fall over. Well, you subconsciously think about that. You don't have to be like, oh, I got to push off a little bit more with my right leg so that I don't fall over. No, you just subconsciously adjust to it because of this system. Now, the main thing is it actually compares the movement that's being monitored to the intended movement. So as you're, let's say, swinging a baseball bat, right? And some of you guys have seen baseball or even basketball, right? In baseball, what happens is if you're swinging that bat and you expect the ball to be moving with certain speed and it's a fastball, well, you need to swing that bat super fast. But if all of a sudden that baseball starts to drop and the speed slows down, and now what you're looking at is a curveball instead of a fastball, what happens then? Well, that ball is going super fast and then it drops. The great players are able to adjust. The spinocerebellar system are able to trigger subconsciously a change in their swing. So then as they're swinging, they're able to then compensate for that slight movement of the baseball. So then you're bringing that signal from your arms, telling you where your arm is. So then you can adjust, so then you have a slightly more uppercut swing. So then you can hit the ball as it's starting to dip. That's a spinocerebellar system. Or you're playing basketball and somebody is trying to steal the ball away from you while you're dribbling. So what do? Right? As you're reaching, you might, because of practice, have got this almost subconsciously, where if somebody's trying to reach, you can swing the ball behind your back and cross over, so then you can go, right, and make sure that they don't get the ball. And that happens with basketball players because they practice so much that they're able to adjust almost on the fly, right? all those athletes are able to have that actual intended movement comparison with actual movement and then adjust. That's a spinocerebellar system. Again, one of the only ones that don't cross over. The spinotectal, this one I mentioned before, right? Involved in reflexes that turns the eyes and head towards point of cutaneous stimulation. Meaning what, right? Somebody, you're walking with a friend on your left side and they touch your right shoulder and tap on it. Immediately you turn your head, not to your friend, but to the right side to do a touch deal. That's a spinotectal system, where you turn your head to where you've been touched. The last thing we'll talk about before our break are these areas right here with the homunculus. All right, so the sensory association areas of the cerebral cortex. We have the primary area right here. The primary somatic sensory cortex is in the postcentral gyrus. Post meaning after the central sulcus. And this is where all general sensations and some special sensations end. So all general sensations, pain, pressure, tickle, itch, proprioception, two-point discrimination of your limbs, of your body, all activate. For you to have that sensation, you need to activate neurons found here. Taste sensations also, right? Need to activate neurons found here. If they don't, you will lose that sensation. So it's where these are just some of the general sensations. What else do we see? Taste area found in the postcentral gyrus as well. Smell. Smell is in the frontal lobe. It's weird, but right, the frontal lobe is where we are able to activate the sense of smell. Now, kind of makes sense where our primary auditory cortex is. The primary auditory cortex region is in our temporal lobe, right? Kind of makes sense because that's where your temporal bone is, and that's where your external auditory meatus is, right? Then visual cortex is in the occipital lobe region. Now, besides having those areas for those specific sensations, we will also see a larger area that is meant to associate that sensation. So when you have, right, somebody tapping at your, at your shoulder, you associate it with a friend, right? When you see somebody and you see their face, you associate a name with it. Right? So association areas are really important to give you context for that sensation. Now, in terms of the homunculus, right? The homunculus actually is a little miniature person. It's kind of weird, right? But back in the 16th and 17th century, we didn't know how people actually were produced when they were babies in utero. So we thought, and of course it's sexist as hell now, but we thought that in the male sperm was a very, very, very small person. And then that small person from the male sperm will be introduced into mom. And that small person will embed itself on mom's uterus and just get larger there. That small little person is a homunculus. Crazy, right? Now, we're still using that name, right? And what we're gonna see is this. In the sensory homunculus, this is the representation found in the postcentral gyrus. The larger the picture, the larger the sensory area found in the postcentral gyrus, the more sensitivity. Now let's take a look, right? The regions that are most sensitive. So if you look at your thumb, look at how small your thumb is in your body, and take a look at how big the representation is. Your thumb has greater brain space, right, for its sensation than, right, almost all of your intra-abdominal organs. Think about that, right? Your intra-abdominal organs include your stomach. Small, but it can be bigger, right? It includes your duodenum and your 20 feet of small intestines. It includes your large intestines. It includes as well your kidneys, the bladder, the ureter. It includes your pancreas and your liver and your gallbladder. You see how many organs are intra-abdominal? Yet the space for all the sensations of all of our organs that are intra-abdominal is about the size of your thumb. Meaning that it makes sense that the thumb is more sensitive, and if you get a cut, you get an injury there, you know exactly where you get a cut. Whereas in the intra-abdominal organs, even if you have massive pain here, it's really hard to localize because there's less sensitivity, right? You have many, many meters of intestines, many, many meters of large intestines, yet you have this small little area to interpret signals there. Now, take a look, what else do we see? Between your face, your thumb, and your tongue, right? Take a look, right? And your lips and arms, so your head region and your thumb, right? This whole area, almost a third of your postcentral gyrus is from those really small regions, right? Half of your head, that includes your face and your thumb, and a third of it, of our somatic sensory cortex, are just for those regions, right? Why? Well, we want greater sensitivity there, so then we can, especially in your mouth and your tongue, you can have that sensation of, texture when you're biting and eating something. Right? Now, we will stop right here and take a little break. And we will come back in about 5 minutes, and hopefully we can finish up chapter 14 in a few, by the end of the, our time in the next hour or so. Okay? So let's take a break, 5-minute break. When we come back, we will get restarted. Let me just figure out what's going on and stop taping. All right, so we kind of, let me see, somebody had something in the chat. Yeah, if you definitely, the next lab practical and the material for the final exam lecture are very linked. So I would look at both. All right, so the question was, should we look at the final exam, the next lab practical videos? If you've already taken the lab practical 2, yes, you should go and definitely take a look at the material for, the material for the final exam lab practical, as well as lab practical material, as well as the lecture material as well for this. Now, there will be more time I'm be giving you guys to do the lecture final exam and the lab practical final exam, But do not let things accumulate, because there's gonna be a lot of stuff in the next couple of weeks. So it's just part of what's happened through, we were basically told not to do anything for 2 weeks during the semester. Now, in terms of this homunculus, obviously for questions, I would ask you to know generalities. Which areas are going to be larger, overrepresented? So fingers, hands, thumb, as well as face and throat. Well, when you compare just how small of surface area we have for our wrist, fingers, and our face, and our throat, and our tongue, it really doesn't make a lot of, it's not a very big part of our body, especially not weight-wise as well. So think about that. From our wrist all the way through our fingers, and then our face and tongue region, and even our throat, that's almost 3/4 of this postcentral gyrus. Yet, if we would weigh it, it makes up maybe 5% of our body weight. So there's definitely an overrepresentation from these areas for sensations. Now, because of that, there are times when there are pain in our underrepresented areas, like intra-abdominal organs, right? So those areas in the trunk, take a look at how small the trunk region is right here. The trunk region includes your thorax. It includes all of our, all of the different parts of our lungs and the heart and the viscera there. And it's incredibly small right here. That small little area for all of the really important organs in our chest. Because of that, we might have misinterpreted pain because it's so poorly localized, because you don't have that kind of sensitivity in the abdominal regions. We talked about how many feet of intestines we have, yet the space in our sensory homunculus, our sensory cortex, is incredibly small for all the different sensations we have in the abdomen. And because of that, sometimes pain in the abdomen can be misinterpreted and referred somewhere else. So take a look. Gallbladder can sometimes cause pain in the right upper quadrant right here, in the right shoulder area, which is crazy. Now, your heart, obviously we all know that you can have referred pain through the left arm because of the way that our, C1 and C7 and T1, T2 vertebrae carry that information in. And then you take a look in your kidneys and, all the way throughout right here, you can have referred pain. And usually referred pain is misinterpreted pain in one region of body that is not the source of the stimulus. Now, in terms of pancreas, we do know that even though your pancreas is down here, sometimes the pain in the pancreas gets referred to the right quadrant, right behind where your right scapula would be. So that's pretty far away from where your pancreas really is. But again, you don't have a lot of room in your brain that is meant to just interpret all the abdominal viscera. So sometimes there's a miscommunication and pain is felt elsewhere. Again, with referred pain is almost always seen with pain in the viscera. So small intestines, the abdominal viscera, as well as the thoracic viscera. Now, skeletal muscles are the next continuation right here. Keep in mind, all sensory neurons and sensations ascend. Now we're talking about all voluntary movements, and all voluntary movements descend. They start at the opposite precentral gyrus, and they're going to come down and activate other neurons that will then connect directly to the muscles. So in terms of the control of skeletal muscles, at its core is not quite as difficult. You only have upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. We've already talked about the lower motor neurons. Lower motor neurons are the ones that we saw in chapter 9, the ones that releases acetylcholine onto the skeletal muscle. Well, we looked at it in chapter 9, and we only looked at where it releases acetylcholine. In chapter 11, we said that it is found, the cell body is found in the anterior horn. Now we're going to give it a specific name. The name of the motor neurons that has its cell body on its anterior horn, has its axons that exits out the the ventral root, and then goes to the skeletal muscle. Well, the name is called lower motor neurons. That's all. Lower motor neurons, nothing special, right? Those lower motor neurons are found in the spinal cord, the cell bodies, and it has axons that then go right to your skeletal muscle. In order for those lower motor neurons to get stimulated or even inhibited, we have upper motor neurons that trigger their work. So upper motor neurons are the ones usually from the brain, and the brain is higher up, and because of that, we call it upper motor neurons. We call the combination of these two right here, are motor pathways, and their main purpose is voluntary movement. They're consciously activated to achieve a specific goal. In other words, you consciously start the process, but you don't usually have to think thoroughly, completely as you move. In other words, as you're walking, you start the process, you think about taking a step, but you don't have to think about all the different muscles you have to activate, right? You don't have to think about pushing off with your gastrocnemius and the soleus. You don't have to think about then extending and then going with another round of movement. All you have to do is start the process. And then all of the different areas of our brain will then coordinate the upper motor neurons to activate the lower ones, which then causes the muscles to move. And you can imagine how utterly tired mentally you would be if you have to actively and voluntarily cause each muscle to move, so then you can walk and take a step, and then the other leg, and then you can push over the other leg, right? You'd be exhausted after a couple steps. So we don't want that to be always a conscious thing, or else we'd never be able to run even a short distance. So in order to have voluntary movements, we need 3 steps to occur. The first step, initiation of most voluntary movements, begins in the premotor areas of our cerebral cortex and results in the stimulation of upper motor neurons. This initial planning phase is meant to activate certain motor neurons first and at the proper time. In other words, this planning phase right here allows us to have a coordination. So then we can figure out which muscles to contract first, how hard to push off, and when to push off. So it gives you like a plan of attack. How do we get that movement to start? You can't just activate them all at once. If you do, nothing will move, because all of your flexors and extensors will contract at the same time. So you need a roadmap, right? You need a path on how to and when to activate those muscles. That's what this initiation phase is. How do we coordinate those muscles? How do we know when to contract those muscles? How do we know when to relax those muscles? That's all found in that initial planning phase. Then we activate the proper upper motor neurons, and those upper motor neurons, once activated, descend down, cross over, and stimulate the lower motor neurons, which then stimulate the skeletal muscles to contract. Once we planned it, then we triggered the specific upper motor neurons we want to contract to activate the lower motor neurons. Now, in order to have movement, we also have to inhibit some of the upper motor neurons as well, right? So then as you're picking your feet up, you don't have both flexors and extensors contract. If you did, nothing will move. So we need one set of muscles to relax and activate the other set, right? And that's what this does here. Then as we're starting to move, what happens if you push off too hard with one side? You don't want to fall over, so you need to adjust. So as we are moving, we have interactions in real time with the basal nuclei, the cerebellum, so then we can coordinate and execute the movements as we are moving. So then we don't fall over, because we're not robots. Every now and then, our intended and actual movements are not aligned. So then we have to adjust. That's where the cerebellum, basal nuclei comes in. Now, in terms of the motor areas of the cerebral cortex, 30% of our precentral gyrus contains upper motor neurons, right? And we'll see another 30% in the premotor areas, right? And we will see some motor neurons in the somatic sensory cortex linked, right, to our sensations. Now, the big thing I want you to know is this, right? What is a premotor? What is a prefrontal? Even though they sound similar, they're completely different. Premotor, anterior to the primary motor cortex, contains motor functions organized before initiation. This is where we start planning, the initial planning of the movement, so that we can have real movement and know which muscles and therefore which neurons to activate first, then which neurons to activate second. At the same time, inhibit certain neurons as well. That premotor area is completely different to the prefrontal. prefrontal area, also found in your frontal lobe, is part of our personality cortex that allows us to have our emotional behavior, our mood, our planning, our motivation. It allows us to become who we are, right? It's weird that that one area in the frontal lobe is responsible for all of our movements, as well as our personality. By the way, if you've ever watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, what happens in that movie was that in the old days, they would, if you had some kind of psychopathy, right? Or you might even have just, a little bit of depression, bipolar, all right, type of illnesses as well. What they would do back then in the 40s and 50s was they'll do what's called, right, a lobotomy, or sometimes known as an ice pick lobotomy. What they would do is actually go into the superior orbital fissure with what looks like an ice pick, called a trocar. And because they kind of knew that the frontal lobe is where your personality was, they would start just destroying the frontal lobe. As they destroyed the frontal lobe, they were trying to destroy the personality cortex. Remember, back then they didn't really, know much or know as much about the brain. So they thought by destroying that frontal lobe area where your personality lays, that they would change your behavior. Now, if you ever watch the end of the movie, the Jack Nicholson character, right, had a lobotomy and he couldn't move. He was catatonic. Why? Because if you would go too far back, not only will you destroy that prefrontal cortex for your personality, but you would also destroy that area that plans out movements. And without that area that plans out the movements, you cannot control this primary motor cortex. You can't control when you stimulate those muscles, right? And now you can't move. That's why he was catatonic. And he couldn't move, he couldn't talk, he couldn't do anything at the end of the movie. Now you can imagine, right? It looks savage. And it is a savage kind of thing that they used to do. And I'm glad that, not many people had the misfortune of getting it done. And the ones that did, they would never obviously be the same. Here's a topography of our homunculus for the actual motor region. If you take a look, it's very similar to what we saw for the sensory region. Your tongue, take a look at how big the tongue region is, as well as the thumb and your, right? Between your thumb and your tongue, it's about 20% of your motor cortex. Why? Well, and even your pharynx, and we add the pharynx and your tongue in there, it's almost, a quarter to 30%. Why is it so big? It's because of language. Because we have to produce the proper words at the proper rhythm with the proper emphasis when we're talking, we need a lot of control of the muscles of your vocal cords. We need a lot of control of your tongue so then we can make the words properly. Makes sense, right? How about your thumb? Well, your thumb, opposable thumb, allows us to manipulate a lot better than your 4 other fingers. Keep in mind that when people actually damage their thumb, like in an industrial accident or injury at work, when they get workman's comp, when compared to the thumb and the other fingers, usually you get twice as much money if you damage your thumb because it's so much more important. It's also the reason why when people, right, sometimes damage their thumb and they can't fix it, or it's been amputated in an accident, they will usually use their big toe and do a graft of your big toe, and it takes the place of your thumb. They wouldn't do the same thing for the other fingers. The reason why? It's much more important for apposition, for movement, to have your thumb. Think about all the little things, right? Trying to type, trying to drive without a thumb. God forbid if you have a stick shift. I know most people don't drive stick shift, right? But back in the days, I used to drive stick shift. I can't even imagine driving, right, and doing all those movements without having a thumb. You need an opposable thumb to do a lot of the movements. How about if you have a doorknob? Most of the public places have door handles where you can push down, but homes have doorknobs. Ever try, and I want you to try this, or if you have a doorknob, try opening a doorknob without your thumb. Really hard, right? The thumb is really what gives us the ability to do a lot of different functions right here. Now, in terms of motor signals, there's a direct and indirect pathway. The direct pathway is for maintenance of muscle tone, controlling speed and precision of skilled movements. Indirect, or called the extrapyramidal system, are for less precise movements. And this picture kind of tells us all the different intricate links between how we move and how we adjust with our movement. Take a look at this. Immediately, when we move, we send signals through from the brain into the spinal cord by all these different systems to cause movement of the skeletal muscles. But we need to plan everything. We need to send that information to different areas. Some areas we inhibit so that we don't have unwanted contraction, right? That's where all this feedback comes in. I'm not asking you to memorize all the feedback. We don't have time. I want you to know like the big picture things, right? Which includes sensory ones that we mentioned, and then the specific, these two, right? There's two main pathways I want you to know if that's motor. That's cortical spinal, cortical bulbar. The good news is that they do certain things they do similar things, but at different locations, right? So when I say cortical spinal, think from your cortex to the spinal cord. That's for your skeletal muscles that is below your head. Directs control of movements below the head because there's a spinal cord. Cortical bulbar is then above your head. Cortical bulbar tract directs control of movements in the head and neck region. Right? Now, in the head and neck region, we have our cranial nerves that supplies the motor neurons. In the corticospinal tract, well, the spinal cord contains cell bodies on the anterior horn. Then those lower motor neurons from the anterior horn fire and goes into your skeletal muscles. So then we have movement below the head and neck region. Obviously, we don't have a spinal cord in the head neck region. So where do we get those lower motor neurons if we don't have a spinal cord? We get the lower motor neurons as part of our cranial nerves. So we know for our trigeminal nerve, main sensory nerve, the trigeminal thalamic tract brings all somatic sensations from your face in so that then it can go to the thalamus and then to the postcentral gyrus. Well, the trigeminal nerve also allows us to contract our masseter and the temporalis, our muscles of mastication. So when we want to chew and masticate, what happens? Well, doesn't sound like it's a big deal, but chewing and mastication is incredibly important in letting us digest and absorb nutrients. So we want to be able to chew something, make it go into your throat, swallow it down, and small enough chunks. So as we chew, how do we have that coordination? We have motor signals starting in our motor cortex, which is our precentral gyrus. They contain the upper motor neurons that will then go down into our pons. And in the pons, we'll have the trigeminal nerve that has motor neurons that goes to your temporalis, that goes to your masseter. Those lower motor neurons are part of the trigeminal nerve, and they get activated by way of the cortical bulbar tract. So then we can chew. So then we can, right, then eventually chew enough and swallow down. If we want to speak, how do we get the mouth? How do we get the tongue? How do we get our throat to contract in such a way to produce the sounds that we need? Well, how we get that is we have a pre-planning area, the initiation phase, right? Found in the premotor areas, found in the basal nuclei, and it gives us a roadmap of which motor neurons to activate first. Then we start to activate those motor neurons, and those motor neurons have the cell bodies in the precentral gyrus. As we activate those motor neurons, the motor neurons come down into the pons and goes down into the medulla, where we're going to have your hypoglossal nerve. Hypoglossal nerve then has motor signals that sends that signal to your tongue and to your throat. So then you can activate the tongue and throat to produce the sounds you need to make for that language. So the cranial nerves supplies the lower motor neurons that then stimulates the skeletal muscles of the face of our tongue and mouth and throat that allows us to speak, that allows us to swallow. Corticospinal tract, again, cortex, spinal cord for voluntary, skeletal muscles below the head and neck. 75% to 85% decussate and descend in the lateral corticospinal tracts, supplying all levels of the body. The remaining fibers descend uncrossed in the anterior corticospinal tract, but decussate near the level of the lower neurons. So eventually they will all cross over, but here they're just saying that some of them cross over a little bit higher up, some cross over a little bit lower down. You don't need to know the numbers. The cortical bulbar, like we mentioned, innervates head and neck, chewing, as well as speech, right? Upper motor neurons then activate cranial nerve nuclei for our intended movements. If our intended movement is to, in this example, right, move your eye so then you can, kind of focus, or you can track something as it's moving. Well, if I want to track something that's moving, I gotta move my eye. So upper motor neurons found in that precentral gyrus, remember, you already have a game plan of how to contract it. The upper motor neurons fire, sending that message to the ocular motor nerve, sending that message as well to the trochlear and the abducens nerve, so then I can contract those muscles, so then I can move my eyeball and start tracking. So depending on the function I want in the cortical bulbar system, I can activate it by activating different cranial nerves. And the different cranial nerves then will give us the lower motor neurons to stimulate the muscles I need. Right. The indirect pathway controls conscious and subconscious muscle movements in the trunk and proximal limb. Now, the one I want you to know is this one right here, the vestibulospinal tract. Vestibulospinal tract is the only one I want you to really focus in on, right? And the vestibulospinal tract influences neurons innervating extensor muscles in the trunk and proximal portion of the lower limbs. What makes it important, this one? This helps us maintain upright posture with movement. So then even if you're walking and somebody almost pushes you down, right? This vestibulospinal system allows you to adjust so then you don't fall over. Remember, we're the only animals that are on only 2 feet. Because of that, more of our brain is required for posture, for equilibrium. And when we fall, we can do a lot more damage, right? If we fall and we can do a lot more damage, we got to make sure we don't fall. So we have a lot of systems in place to ensure that we don't. Basal nuclei, sometimes called the basal ganglia, right? Important in planning, organizing, coordinating movements, and posture. Again, right? All these different areas right here, right? All of the, right? These different areas are there so then we can plan, coordinate, and then move. And then as we move, we don't fall over, and we can as well kind of adjust to anything in front of us as we move. Feedback loops among the basal nuclei, the thalamus and the cortex allows us to have fine-tuning of motor neuron activity to cause smooth intended movements, right? They stimulate, facilitating muscle activity like rising from the chair, And it also contains inhibitory signals that inhibits unwanted movements. So when you're getting up from a chair, you're standing, you're walking, you're probably just thinking about getting up, right? You're not worried about those antagonistic muscles and having to shut them down. You might think about contracting your abdomen, right? So then you can suck in your stomach. You might be thinking about contracting your legs, so then you can push up. But almost nobody thinks about having to relax the hamstring muscles, right? So the basal nuclei takes over. So then you don't have to do that. Cerebellum. We kind of mentioned that cerebellum is one of those rare instances where we see it and you need to know it for lecture exam 3 and 4. Why? Because so much of it, I mean, we have more neurons in the cerebellum than we have in the cerebrum. And when you consider the cerebellum is about half the size, a third of the size of the cerebrum, it's amazing just how packed full of neurons are actually found in the cerebellum. And it's important for that movement, adjusting to movement, right, in real time. So we have what's called a cerebellar comparator function, and it piggybacks on the spinocerebellar tract. And what we get in this cerebellar comparator function is ability to compare actual versus intended movements and then adjust in real time. Example, right? Think about what happens when you're playing basketball and you practice. As you're playing basketball and you practice a lot, you're going to practice your shot, practice your dribbling. As you practice, you might get so good you know exactly where you should stand and where your fingers are, how far and how high to jump, and where your release point is for the ball, so then it goes in most of the time. Now, as we do that and practice, now we have our intended movement, right? Sometimes they call it visualization, right? You know and you visualize what your shot should be. Now you're in a game time situation. And what happens? Well, there's somebody guarding you. If somebody's guarding you, your intended movement might be different. So as you're about to shoot, instead of just open air and you're just able to release it at a certain point, well, what happens? That person doesn't want you to score. So he's trying to block your shot, he or she. As he or she is trying to block your shot, now you have to adjust in real time. You might have to release it earlier. You might have to release it faster. So then you avoid the person trying to block your shot. Well, what do? Right? We need to send that signal so then we can adjust. So our cerebellum is going to compare the intended movement to our actual movement and change it. So then we're able then to avoid that person trying to block your shot. At the same time, still have a probability of making that shot. That's what the cerebellar comparator function is, right? Taking that information from practice, right? Activating the lower motor neurons. So then you know what the general sensation, that general proprioceptive signal is. And then having to adjust. Having to adjust, then making changes. So then you can adjust. So then the ball hopefully will go in the net, even though somebody's trying to block your shot. Perfect. I know I use a lot of, sports, so sorry if you don't like the sports, but it's really hard to talk about, the comparator function without talking about sports. Here are the brainstem functions. All ascending and descending pathways must pass through the brainstem. Most of our nuclei are found in the brainstem. The nuclei from cranial nerves 2 to 12 are located in the brainstem. Many reflexes important to survival are also found in the brainstem, which we kind of know, right? Your medulla oblongata, that's where your cardiovascular reflex, cardiovascular center, and your respiratory center lies, right? So your blood pressure, your heart rate, your respiratory rate, all lies here. Then you have the reticular activating system, which controls the sleep-wake cycle and receives input from cranial nerves 2, 8 as well. right? Now, the last few things we're going to talk about today are specific brain function areas. And this is really interesting. And that's Wernicke's and Broca's. They're usually found only on the left side of your cerebral cortex. Now, they're both part of our speech centers. One allows us to learn that language, learn the sounds of that language. That's Wernicke's. We say that's sensory speech. So as you're learning a new language, this is an area that we're trying to activate, that we're trying to train. Now, keep in mind, all speech from all the thousands of languages, and yes, there are thousands of different languages in our world, all the speech and all the thousands of different variations of speech all come from a very narrow frequency. So when we talk about sound, sound is frequency, right? Anything else is amplitude, how loud it is. So in terms of language, there's a very small frequency that is, you know, within like 10,000 millihertz, that is going to be found in all speech. So all speech is found in this very small band of frequencies. Because it's all very small, right, this band is, it's really hard to train your brain and hard to learn language. That's why we know that the younger you are when you start learning languages, the better, because your brain is more plastic, right? Even better yet, your ears are actually better and are able to hear higher pitches at younger ages. Now, the Wernicke's area is for understanding of language. So when you're learning that language and understanding the meaning of words, that's the area we wanted to train, the Wernicke's area. That's the most important area, right? The understanding of what is heard, and then coming up with the words in that language to say as you try to respond to what somebody's asking you. So Wernicke's is an understanding of language. The Wernicke's area right here is found in the left temporal lobe. Why is that important? Remember, the temporal lobe region is where our hearing centers are. So it kind of makes sense that Wernicke's for speech and hearing, right, of certain speeches and certain languages. Well, Wernicke's is found in the left temporal lobe. Then Broca's is found in the frontal lobe region. Broca's area is important for saying the words. How do we produce the words in English versus Chinese versus Spanish, right? And remember, small changes are the only difference, right? So everything has a set frequency. So we have to say the frequency specific, because if the frequency goes a little too high or too low, it changes the word, changes the language completely even. So we need to say it with very, very great sensitivity. So the Broca's area is how we produce the words as we respond, right? How do we produce those words? That's Broca's. And that's all what we call motor speech. Saying the words, emphasizing it, training the tongue, training the lips, training the pharynx, so then you can say the words properly for that language. That's Broca's area. Now, the great thing is this, and it's kind of cool, and I'll come back to this picture. This picture is showing us how we're able to integrate certain information. And usually is this, right? They put you in a PET scan. In a PET scan, they basically like a CT scan, but they give you an active agent that's tagged, like radioactive glucose. Now, the little bit of radioactivity allows us to see areas of the brain that lights up and becomes more active at certain points. We use glucose, or usually we use something called dextrose, which is glucose, right? We tag it and we use glucose because we know your brain will pick up a lot of glucose. So the more active the brain is, the more glucose it picks up. So the more glucose is picked up, now that glucose is tagged with a little bit of a radioisotope. So then as the glucose goes into areas that are active, we put you in a PET scan, we can read the radioactivity, And the more bright the region is, the more active it becomes, right? So here, what they do is this. They show a person a picture of a red car. Now remember, I already infused you with radioactive glucose. Again, real small radiation dose, right? And as that radioactive glucose goes in the brain, I wheel you into a CT scan, and now we're gonna look at different regions of the brain, and it will light up with certain activity. So right here, I show you a picture of a red car, and I want you to tell me what it is, to say it. So as I'm showing the person, while they're in the CAT scan, CT machine, right? As I'm showing them a picture that's on, right, embedded on the actual machine, right? The picture is a red car. Now they have to say the words in their language. What happens? When they first look at the picture, the occipital lobe brightens up because there's more activity there when they first see it. So it's a sign of activity. The brighter the region is, the more active. Why? Because the more active that region is, the more glucose it picks up, the more radiation that's seen in that area. Perfect. So as they first see that picture, the occipital lobe region, the visual cortex region brightens up. It's a sign that they have seen that picture. And now they have to produce the words that correspond to that picture. So the next thing they do is send that visual cortex signal to our language centers because you have to say the words. And the language centers were Wernicke's. So Wernicke's brightens up as they're trying to find the proper words for the corresponding picture. Once they found the word, now they need to send the signal to the motor control areas so then they can activate the motor neurons in their mouth, in their tongue, in their throat. So then they can contract those muscles to produce the word. So we send the signal from Wernicke's. Once we have the words, we send it to Broca's. And Broca's will give us a roadmap on how to contract the muscles of your lips, mouth, tongue, and throat. As we create that roadmap here, we activate the motor signals, right? The motor neurons that will then go into your mouth, lips, tongue, and throat, so then you can see the words red car. And that's what we see here. You first see it through the visual cortex. Now you need to produce the words. So you send the signal to Wernicke's. Wernicke's comes out with the proper words. Then you need to send that signal so then we can, contract the muscles properly. So then we can say the words in that language. Send it to Broca's. Broca's gives us a roadmap on how to contract those muscles. And then we send it to the primary motor cortex so we can activate the neurons that will go to those muscles. So we can then stimulate the muscles to say the word properly, red car. Pretty crazy, right? Now, there is a little bit of what we call cerebral hemisphere, or hemispherization right here. In the old days, we think this was a little bit more cut and dry. We now know that there are a lot of people that are right and left brain, right? So because of the way the brain is cut in half, right? The right side controls muscular activity in and receives sensory information from the left side of the body because of decussations occurring. The left side also then controls activity and receives sensory information from the right side. So contralateral sides, right? Sensory information of both hemispheres are shared through the corpus callosum and through the anterior commissures. Now, there are parts of our brain. Now, if we think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? We said normally the left temporal lobe only is where we see Wernicke's. So it makes sense that the left side right there is for speech, is for mathematics. Usually people that are left-brained are usually very logical Spock characters in Star Trek. The person that looks at all the different, almost cold and calculated person, right? That's somebody that's more left brain. The person that's more right brain are more the artists, right? Three-dimensional, spatial perception, musical abilities. These are artists being right-brained. Keep in mind, we now know there's a lot more people there are a lot of people that are right just as good with music as they are with math. All right, so it's not going to be set in stone, but this is the generality of it. So if you heard of people saying that they're left brain and right brain, that's what they're talking about. By the way, you can be a genius in mathematics and you can be a genius in musical abilities, right? If you guys have ever seen how people write, I mean, we know, you know, mathematics now with this huge STEM, right? Kind of proponents here, huge STEM emphasis. I'm worried about people that are right brain not getting their just due, right? Have you ever seen something complex like right? If you've ever seen like Mozart's and how he's able to use music, right? And to incorporate all the different types of instruments into one functional orchestra is just as same level of genius ability as Albert Einstein is and his mathematics, right? Keep in mind that when Mozart was writing all that music, he was like 8 years old. So how was he able to do all that? It's because he's a genius in that, right? So we can be geniuses in both. Memory, and then we're almost done. Memory, and I want you to know the difference, and it's pretty cool. Working memory, short-term and long-term. Working memory is something that is very, very short-term. Most is lost immediately, meaning what? And then you're probably asking me, why do we have working memory that's lost immediately? Well, what happens is we don't really want to keep it all the time because it just takes up too much room. Working memory is the ability to connect what you have just read to what you're reading in the next sentence. So as you're reading one sentence to the next, what happened is as you're reading one sentence, you have forgotten what happened in the previous sentence. It would make it impossible to understand anything, right? At the same time, what happens if you remember every single sentence? The exact date when you learned it, at the exact time, at the exact page, right? Well, that's a lot of facts that you are trying to get weighed down with. So working memory allows us to link what we are reading previously in a previous sentence to what we're reading now. So then we can connect those two sentences and understand the gist of the paragraph. That's working memory. It kind of makes sense why it's lost, because once you understand the gist of it, did you really have to memorize that previous one? No, you just kind of understand that that's where you learned it, that's it. Now, short-term memory, information retained for a few seconds to a few minutes. Most is lost within a short time. That's what's happening as we're trying to cram before an exam. As you're trying to cram, and I see this sometimes, people try to write things out, right before an exam, and then when they get the exam, they try to write it again. And what happens sometimes is that they miswrite it again, right? And that short-term memory is lost once you've done written it. And that's it. What we're trying to do is achieve long-term memory. There's two types, declarative and procedural. One, you'll almost never lose. That's a procedural. Development of skills, such as riding a bike. That doesn't mean that you're gonna be just as good when you know, most of you guys have learned how to ride a bike, but most of us, once we've, you know, driven a little bit, don't really ride bikes much. So what happens is, even though you haven't rode a bike in years, when you see a bike, you're able to get on it, you're able to pedal without falling over. That doesn't mean it's just as comfortable, right? If you've ever been able to ride a bike and you're used to it, you can go up, ride a bike and not fall over. At the same time, you might not even have to put your hands on those, right, on the handles. Now, if you try to do that after a couple years of not riding a bike, you will fall over, right? So even though you can still do it, because you're no longer as familiar with it, you will not have the same skills. The good news is it only takes a couple days before you will get the same skill. That's procedural. Small amount is lost through time. Now, Decorative can be lost, but usually lost due to damage to the neurons. So once you understand how something works, right? You understand, instead of just short-term memory, you understand how the heart works. Well, usually by understanding it, you know it. Usually the only time you lose it is if there's some kind of damage. Think about your multiplication charts, right? You guys know, if I ask you, what is 5 times 5, 5 times 6? You don't have to put that, hopefully, on a calculator. You know it pretty well, right? Because you have used it and you have trained your brain when you were younger to memorize it. So then almost immediately, 5 times 5, 25. Don't have to think about it. But what happens if you have a stroke and those neurons are no longer linked? Well, you will have to relearn it then. That's the thing about long-term memory. They can be lost, but usually it's lost with trauma or some kind of damage. Right. The last thing is the memory engrams that they talk about here. Traces, repetition and association of new information with existing memories assists in the transfer of information from short-term to long-term memory, right? Most of us are going to remember this time for the rest of our lives. You'll remember where you were when you first heard about coronavirus, right? And almost immediately, you will go back to that date when you first found out about how devastating it will be, right? And what happens is, the stronger the emotional component is, the greater the chance that short-term memory turns into long-term. Your parents, if they were young enough, or back then, or old enough now, will always remember the time, if they were around, what happened on, with JFK, right, assassination, Martin Luther King assassination, right? I wasn't born yet, so I don't, but, right, Americans know that date like it's ingrained in their head, right? 9/11, ingrained in their head, right? The stronger the emotional component with a fact, the greater the transition between short-term memory to long-term memory. That's why the painful memories are almost always with us, right? The last thing, effects of aging on the nervous system, gradual decline in sensory motor functions, reflex slows, size and weight of the brain decreases. Now, in some people, it's offset. That's why I want everybody, even when you're done doing whatever you want to do in the future, to stay mentally active. That's important. We know that the ability to retain facts, the ability to fight off any kind of brain injuries, and to come back if you did, has to do with the ability to learn new things. So that's why you hear about people on TED Talk talking about, being old and learning new tricks. That's why, right? Decreased short-term memory in most people. Usually, long-term memory is unaffected and sometimes even improved, right? And of course, we see changes in sleep patterns in people that are older. Now, long-term memory is unaffected because those memories have been ingrained from so many years in your lifetime of using those memories that you seldom lose it unless you have real damage, right? You have a stroke, and that area, and therefore that pathway of that memory is now lost. If the memories are lost and the pathway is lost, obviously there's nothing you can do to regain it. All right. Any questions, guys?
I have a question.
Really? All right. What I'm going to do is post this for the final exam material. And I think we do have already videos on that from my lectures, right, from previous years. So I will post both, and you can kind of look at whichever one you want. It should be very much identical. The notes are identical. I think just, one is me kind of lecturing on the board versus me just on the actual PowerPoint, right? So probably nobody wants to see me on the board, so I'll post this up. We will, on Thursday, go through any questions you have, and we will also go through some of the brain material, all right, and kind of walk us, you know, going over some of that. Now, all right, next week we will, you know, go through chapter 15, and I do want you guys to review those, all right? Now, if you have any questions, email me. Keep in mind, your main thing for this next week, all right, this week, I mean, is to make sure you do your lecture exam 3, all right? So then you don't have 3 and 4 to worry about next week. So make sure you review, and when you're ready, take lecture exam 3 this week and this weekend, okay? All right. I will stop right here. And hold on, somebody else had a question. All right. Nope. No, lab practical 3, the final lab practical, you guys saw, right? It's only on the brain, the eyes, and the ears, okay? It's not cumulative. Do we have a written exam for number 3? We will not have a written. We will have like a assignment, all right? Just to make it a little bit easier on everybody and less stressful, okay? It'll be an assignment that you download and then re-upload, okay? I believe it's very similar to what we saw. Is it what we call a dynamic assignment that I will post on Wednesday. Again, final lab practical, only, right, on that, you know, the brain, spinal cord, eyes and ears, that's it, all right? It's no more muscles, no more nothing like that, no more muscles of the face, things like that, okay? And for the, you know, final exam, there should be final exam stuff that we saw. All right, let me see if I can, I don't think I have it on my this computer, but you will see that in Excel, there's a tab for final exam material. When you open it up, on the left lower bottom, there's a little tab. So just hit that. It includes sensory, which is like your eyes and ears, and the brain material. All right, take care, guys. I will see you on Thursday, okay? Oh, no, there's a picture of me.